Hello history fans and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Elizabethan England. Now if you are here just because you enjoy history, you enjoy the Tudors, you enjoy Elizabethan England, please do stay, enjoy the rambles about history. But if you're here to revise, this is the EDEXCEL GCSE. I'm just going to be reading from the book. Please remember, I'm not a history teacher. This is just to be an extra little bit of helpful history for you so you can have the video playing while you're getting ready or doing something else, but you still feel like you want to be revising. So good luck with your exams. I hope this helps a bit. Do leave a comment below if you want any other topics or the other exam board. I will try my best to do that for you. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and let's get going. Okay, so we start with English society and government in 1558. In 1558, England had been governed by Tudor monarchs for more than 70 years. The country had well-organised systems of central and local government, but there were some major divisions in society. Then there's the Tudor family tree for you. Elizabeth ruled with the support of the Privy Council. Elizabeth was the most powerful figure in Elizabethan England. Everyone was expected to be loyal to the Queen and obey her. The Privy Council was a group of around 20 of the Queen's most trusted councillors. They advised her on all aspects of government and ensured her wishes were carried out. They were expected to obey her orders even if they disagreed with her. Parliament was made up of members of the nobility and the gentry. The Queen needed Parliament's consent to pass new laws or raise taxes. Parliament only met when the Queen summoned it, and Elizabeth tried to avoid using it. She only called Parliament 13 times during her 44-year reign. The Queen relied on members of the nobility and gentry to enforce law and order throughout the country. Local government posts like Justice of the Peace and Sheriff were unpaid, but many men volunteered in order to increase their local power and influence. Justices of the Peace were particularly important. They enforced the law, provided for the poor, and ensured roads and bridges were maintained. Elizabeth used patronage to ensure the support of the nobility and gentry. This often involved handing out titles and offices that gave the holder a source of income. Elizabeth distributed patronage widely to ensure that no one felt left out. This helped ensure political stability. There were social and economic divisions. England's population had been rising steadily since around 1500. Most people lived and worked in rural areas, and towns and cities were growing rapidly. London was by far the largest and most important city. The economy was dominated by agriculture, but farming practices were changing. The export of woolen cloth to Europe was very important to the economy, but merchants were also starting to explore trade with the Americas and Asia. Elizabethan society was dominated by a small, land-owning aristocracy of nobility and gentry. The gentry were part of the social elite in Elizabethan England, below the level of nobility. Members of the gentry were people who owned land and lived off the income it provided. They didn't have to do other work to survive. There was great inequality, and the divide between rich and poor was growing. Poverty became a major problem in Elizabethan England. The challenges of a female monarch. Elizabeth had a rocky start in life and faced some pretty serious problems when she first became queen. She was cautious, intelligent, and powerful. She was Henry VIII's second child, the daughter of his second wife, Anne Boleyn, and as a child she was third in line to the throne behind Edward VI and Mary I, so no one really expected her to become queen. She had a difficult upbringing and sometimes feared for her life. In 1554, she was accused of conspiring against her half-sister Mary and placed under house arrest for almost a year. Elizabeth was very cautious and only trusted a few close advisors. She could also be indecisive. She was reluctant to make decisions without carefully considering their possible consequences. She was intelligent, confident, and well-educated. Despite having had little training in how to govern, she became a powerful and effective leader. She faced many difficulties when she became queen. In 1533, Henry VIII had divorced his first wife Catherine of Aragon and married Anne Boleyn. Divorce was forbidden in the Catholic Church, so many Catholics believed Henry's marriage to Anne was not valid and their daughter Elizabeth was illegitimate. When Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn was dissolved and Anne was executed in 1536, Henry declared Elizabeth illegitimate. Although Henry later changed his mind about this one, Some Protestants still questioned Elizabeth's legitimacy. This, of course, weakened her claim to the throne. People also thought it was unnatural for women to rule, of course. In the 16th century, most people believed the monarch should be a man. They thought that rule by a woman was unnatural. The violence and chaos of Mary I's reign had reinforced people's belief that women could not rule successfully. Most people expected Elizabeth to act as a figurehead without any real power. They thought she should let her male councillors take control or find a husband to govern for her. Elizabeth was determined to rule in her own right and refused to let her councillors take over. She was expected to marry and produce an heir. Because people believed women couldn't rule effectively, there was pressure for Elizabeth to find a husband who could rule for her. I feel like we've already said that, so maybe that's important to remember. Yeah, she didn't marry. It's important. There were also concerns about the succession if Elizabeth died without an heir. There would be a risk of civil war, with different groups competing for the throne. To prevent this, Elizabeth was expected to marry and produce an heir as quickly as possible. Elizabeth was reluctant to marry. Women had to obey their husbands, so she would lose her power and freedom if she married. Because she never married, she became known as the Virgin Queen. Challenges at home and from abroad. As if the difficulties of being a female ruler weren't enough, Elizabeth also had other problems to deal with when she became queen. The economy was weak and there was a serious threat of French invasion. I feel like we're going quite dark, so I'm just going to turn the light on. I feel like that looks like it's done absolutely nothing, but when the sun goes down a tiny bit more, I think it will show. So, the English economy was weak. Under King Edward VI, huge sums of money had been spent on wars in Scotland. Queen Mary I had also spent too much money, and as a result, Elizabeth inherited enormous debts when she became queen. Fun times for her. Mary had sold off large amounts of land owned by the crown to cover her debts. Although this had raised money in the short term, in the longer term it reduced the monarch's income from rent. The taxation system was old-fashioned and ineffective. While ordinary people faced high taxes, it became very common for members of the nobility and gentry to pay less tax than they owed. England was suffering high levels of inflation. This meant that prices were rising while wages stayed the same or fell. The poor and those living in urban areas were hit the hardest by inflation. Elizabeth quickly ended war with France. In 1557, Mary I took England to war with France. She did this to support her husband, King Philip II of Spain, who was already fighting the French. The war was not a success. In January 1558, the French conquered Calais, England's last remaining territory on the European mainland. This made it more difficult for the English to control the Channel, I nearly said Chanel, and increased the risk of a French invasion. When Elizabeth became queen in November 1558, she wanted to end the war with France as quick as possible. Peace was agreed in 1559. But there was still French threat in Scotland. When Elizabeth became queen, Scotland was controlled by France's Catholic royal family, and there were many French troops in the country. However, French rule was unpopular with many Scots. In 1558, Mary, Queen of Scots, married the heir to the French throne. As Catholics, the French royal family disliked Elizabeth, a Protestant, and wanted England to be ruled by a Catholic. Mary's marriage increased the risk that the French might invade from Scotland to try and put her on the English throne. In the late 1550s, Scottish Protestants, led by the preacher John Knox, rebelled against French rule. They appealed to England for support, and in 1560 English troops and ships were sent to them. The French were defeated and forced to leave Scotland. The departure of the French, combined with the death of Mary's French husband in 1560, greatly reduced the threat of invasion. Religious divisions in 1558. By 1558, 30 years of dizzying religious change had created deep divisions between the Catholic and Protestants. The Protestant Reformation began in Germany in the early 16th century and gradually spread across Europe. Reformers challenged many Catholic beliefs and practices. This is all religious change. So Henry VIII broke away from the Roman Catholic Church. Edward VI tried to make England more Protestant. Mary I restored Catholicism and persecuted the Protestants. And Elizabeth I wanted religious stability. She had been raised a Protestant, although she hid her beliefs during Mary's reign to avoid being imprisoned. She was deeply religious and committed to Protestantism. She had seen the turmoil caused by Edward VI's extreme Protestant reforms and the violence of Mary I's Catholic restoration. She wanted to end the constant religious changes of the last 30 years by creating a stable and lasting religious settlement. And are we on to the religious settlement? We are. The religious settlement of 1559. After the turmoil of her predecessors' reigns, Elizabeth was determined to bring religious stability to England. In 1559, she passed her religious settlement, a clever compromise between Protestant and Catholic beliefs. The Act of Supremacy gave Elizabeth control over the Church. Henry VIII and Edward VI had used the title of Supreme Head of the Church of England. In her Act of Supremacy in 1559, though, Elizabeth altered the title to make herself Supreme Governor of the English Church. The Act of Supremacy required churchmen and people holding public office to swear the oath of supremacy. They had to recognise the Queen as Supreme Governor and promise to be loyal to her. Most parish priests took the oath. However, all but one of the Catholic bishops refused and lost their post. They were replaced by Protestant bishops. The Act of Uniformity made moderate Protestant reforms. The Act of Uniformity and the Royal Injunctions, both passed in 1559, imposed moderate Protestant reforms on the English Church, but they also made some concessions to English Catholics. The reforms were going to church was compulsory. There were fines if you missed a service. There was a new Book of Common Prayer, and all parishes had to have a copy of the Bible in English, whereas the concessions meant the wording of the communion service was kept deliberately vague so that it could be accepted by both Protestant and Catholic, and churches were allowed to keep some decorations, but priests had to wear a certain Catholic vestment, which is a robe. Elizabeth wanted everyone in England to conform to her religious settlement. Royal commissioners were ordered to visit churches throughout the country to ensure that the Acts of Injunctions were being enforced. Of course, at the time, the church played a very important role in English society, and English senior churchmen were involved in government. All bishops held a seat in the House of Lords, and the Archbishop of Canterbury was actually a member of the Privy Council. Parish priests were often the most educated people in their communities, which made them respected and influential. And the church helped to promote national unity and obedience to the Queen. The Queen's coat of arms was often displayed in churches, and church services included prayers for the Queen and her counsellors. Challenges to the religious settlement, though, of course existed. Nothing's easy. Hopefully this exam will be for you, though. Elizabeth's religious settlement faced many challenges in the 1560s, and some were more serious than others. Puritans wanted to make the English Church more Protestant. They were the extreme Protestants, Puritans. And for them, Elizabeth's religious settlement was only a first step, and they wanted to make further reforms to remove all traces of Catholicism from the church. And then there's some information on what they did, and Elizabeth tolerated it at first, but in 1565 she ordered the Archbishop of Canterbury to ensure that all priests wore the surplice. Those Puritans who still refused lost their jobs or were imprisoned. Many members of the nobility also continued to practice Catholicism. The compromises in the religious settlement won some of them around, but others refused to attend church services, and they were known as recusants. The Catholic nobility was influential, especially in Lancashire. But to minimise the threat, Elizabeth did not force the Catholic nobility to attend church services. As long as they didn't make a public show of their beliefs, they were allowed to continue practising. France and Spain at this point, luckily, were distracted by domestic difficulties, because there was, of course, a risk that the Catholic rulers of France and Spain might try to reverse Elizabeth's religious settlement and replace her with a Catholic monarch. However, neither country was really in position to challenge the religious settlement during the 1560s. The threat of French invasion was serious in the first years of Elizabeth's reign, but faded with the start of the Wars of Religion in 1562. In the 1560s as well, Spain was facing a growing revolt in the Netherlands. To prevent an alliance forming between England and the Protestant Netherlands, Spain tried to stay on good terms with Elizabeth and avoided challenging her religious settlement. And the papacy lacked military support. Papacy, the Pope, had the power to excommunicate Elizabeth, but that might encourage Catholic countries to invade England. It could also encourage rebellion at home by releasing Elizabeth's Catholic subjects from their duty of loyalty to her. However, neither France nor Spain had the military resources to invade England, and there was no clear support for a revolt against Elizabeth at home, so the Pope didn't take any action against her in the 60s. By the 60s, of course, I mean the 1560s. Next up, we have Mary, Queen of Scots. As I said, I'm not a history teacher. Please don't use this as your only source of revision. We are skimming through a lot of things. Even though Elizabeth and Mary were cousins, Elizabeth wasn't too pleased when Mary arrived in England for an unexpected visit in 1568. In fact, she was so unimpressed, she sent her to prison. Mary was the only child of James V of Scotland. She is related to the Tudors through her grandmother, Margaret Tudor. I'm very low down now. And Margaret was Henry VIII's sister. Lots of family connections that hopefully you guys know already. In 1558, when Mary was 15 years old, she married the heir to the French throne. However, her husband died suddenly in 1560 and Mary returned to Scotland. She then fled to England in 1568. But, rewind, in 1565, Mary married the Scottish nobleman Lord Darnley, and the marriage was not a happy one. In 1566, a group of Scottish nobles accompanied by Darnley stabbed David Rizzo, Mary's personal secretary, to death. In 1567, Darnley was murdered, and so people believed that Mary and her close friend were actually behind the murder, and their suspicions were confirmed. Because Mary then marries the Earl of Bothwell, who was the friend who was suspected to have helped Mary murder her husband. So another unpopular marriage with Scottish nobles, who then rebelled against Mary, and they imprisoned her and forced her to abdicate in favour of her one-year-old son James. So in 1568, Mary escapes from prison and raised an army. Her forces were defeated in battle and she fled to the south of England. And when Mary got to England, she was imprisoned, but still posed a threat because Elizabeth had Mary imprisoned and set up an inquiry to investigate whether she had actually been involved in her husband's murder. And Elizabeth didn't want the inquiry to find Mary guilty. A guilty verdict would lend support to the actions of the Scottish nobles who had overthrown Mary, their legitimate queen. However, Elizabeth didn't want the not guilty verdict either, because that would force her to release Mary, and once free, Mary might use her claim to the English throne to try and overthrow Elizabeth. And in the end, the inquiry didn't reach a verdict. This enabled Elizabeth to keep Mary in captivity. Elizabeth hoped that imprisoning Mary would prevent her becoming the centre of Catholic plots, but Mary's presence caused problems for Elizabeth through the next 20 years. So Mary, Queen of Scots is quite important to this story, isn't it? Next we have the revolt of the Northern Earls, 1569 to 1570, and the Northern Earls were unhappy for several different reasons. They were still committed Catholics. Elizabeth had confiscated large areas of lands from them and reduced their power by increasing her control in the north. And they believed that some advisors or members of the Privy Council, especially William Cecil, had become too powerful. They wanted to remove these evil councillors and replace them with men who would be more sympathetic to their own interests. The revolt of the Northern Earls broke out in November of 1569 with the Duke of Norfolk, the wealthiest landowner in England, hatching a plan to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, and have her recognised as Elizabeth's heir. This plan was supported by Catholic nobles, including the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland, because it meant that Elizabeth would be succeeded by a Catholic queen. When the plan was uncovered, the Earls feared that they would be executed for their involvement, and in a desperate attempt to escape punishment, they rebelled and tried to overthrow Elizabeth. In November 1569, they captured Durham and then marched south, probably making for Derbyshire, where Mary was imprisoned. But before the rebels reached there, a large royal army forced them to retreat, and many of their troops deserted, with 2 of the Earls fleeing to Scotland. And Elizabeth showed the Earls very little mercy, because the revolt had been a serious threat to her rule. It showed the danger that Mary, Queen of Scots, represented as a rallying point for English Catholics. And then in 1570, Pope Pius V excommunicated Elizabeth, which was supposed to strengthen the revolt, but news of it didn't arrive until after the rebels had fled. But the excommunication didn't make the Catholic threat seem more serious, because it meant the Catholics no longer had to obey the Queen and were encouraged to overthrow her. Then there's 2 pages on Catholic plots at home. During the 1570s and 1580s, there were several Catholic plots to assassinate Elizabeth and replace her with Mary. The plots involved European conspirators and were supported by France, Spain, and the Pope. The Ridolfi plot aimed to put Mary on the English throne. Robert di Ridolfi was an Italian banker who played a small part in the revolt of the Northern Elves we mentioned earlier, and in 1571 he used his Catholic contacts in England and Europe to develop a plot to overthrow Elizabeth. He planned to assassinate Elizabeth and then marry Mary to the Duke of Norfolk and make her queen. He was supported by the Pope and King Philip II, who agreed to provide troops for a Spanish invasion, but the plot failed largely because Elizabeth's allies passed the names of the main conspirators to her. They also intercepted letters by Mary which implicated her and Norfolk in the plot, so Norfolk was arrested and executed, but Mary was not punished, although her supervision was made a lot tighter. Walsingham then uncovered the Throckmorton plot in 1583, and Catholic plots did pose a real threat to Elizabeth, but they did have some significant weaknesses, because Elizabeth was a popular ruler and the conspirators did lack public support a lot of the time. Philip II was also reluctant to destroy his alliance with Elizabeth, and Elizabeth's informants and later Walsingham's highly efficient spy network ensured the plots were uncovered before they were fully developed. Walsingham knew every stage of the 1586 Babington plot. The Babington plot led to the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Mary's execution reduced the threat from Catholics at home, but increased the threat from abroad, because it inflamed Catholic opposition abroad and increased the threat of foreign invasion. In 1587, relations with Spain were at a low point. The two countries were at war over the Netherlands, and Philip II had been preparing for an attack on England since 1585. Mary's execution made the situation worse. Philip was now even more determined to invade, and there's also danger that Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, might seek revenge for his mother's death. That's 2 whole pages though, and I have whizzed through and picked out some bits. Again, please don't use this as your only revision. I hope it's a nice little reminder. Relations with Spain had tried to stay on good terms, but the rivalry between them led to growing tensions. England and Spain were political and religious rivals. There was commercial rivalry in the Spanish Netherlands and in the New World. Trade with Spain's colonies in North and South America was very profitable, but foreigners weren't allowed to trade with them unless they had a license, and very few Englishmen were granted licenses. Elizabeth encouraged privateers, men who sailed their own vessels, to trade illegally with Spanish colonies, raid Spanish ships, and attack the treasure fleets carrying gold and silver from the Americas to Spain. Because the privateers were supposedly independent, Elizabeth could deny any responsibility for their activities that helped prevent open conflict with Philip. She's smart, isn't she? Elizabeth received a share of the privateers' profits, and given England's financial weakness, this was a very important source of income for her. The treasure she received from Drake in 1580 was worth more than all the rest of her income for that year put together. Francis Drake was her leading privateer, sailing around the world and carrying out a number of raids on Spanish settlements and ships. Then we have the war with Spain, 1585 to 1588. By the 1580s, the tension between England and Spain had reached a boiling point. Elizabeth and Philip were still reluctant to confront one another, but in 1585 they finally went to war over the Netherlands. Elizabeth's support for the Dutch rebels led to a war with Spain. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, was appointed to lead the military expedition to the Netherlands, but his campaigns in the Netherlands were unsuccessful. He wasn't a talented general. His officers were very divided over questions of strategy, and he had a very small army compared to the number of Spanish troops. The English army were also poorly equipped, and Elizabeth didn't provide sufficient funds to pay the English troops. Then we have Drake's raid on Cadiz in 1587. Drake was sent to disrupt Spanish preparations for the Armada. Drake attacked the Spanish port of Cadiz in 1587, and the raid on Cadiz was a serious setback for the Spanish Armada. The Spanish Armada of 1588, well done. But right from the start for that Spanish Armada, things weren't going to plan. The Armada planned to meet the Duke of Parma at Dunkirk. So the Armada reached the English Channel in July of 1588. But they were delayed for several weeks because of bad weather on the Bay of Biscay, and because English fleets had attempted to intercept them. In July of 1588, they're sighted off Cornwall, and news is sent to Elizabeth in London. So English ships set sail from Plymouth to meet the Armada, and the Armada sailed up the channel in a crescent formation. This was an effective defensive strategy which used the large armed galleons to protect the weaker supply and troop ships. The English Navy carried out a few minor raids but was unable to inflict much damage, and only 2 Spanish ships were lost, and both of them were destroyed by accident. Then the English attacked the Spanish at Calais and Gravelines. And I hope you all know how the Spanish Armada ends, because I can't make sense of this because I've not studied it. Having sailed up the channel, eventually 5 Spanish ships were sunk and the rest of the fleet was forced to sail away from the French coast and into the North Sea. An English fleet followed the Spanish as far north as Scotland to make sure they didn't regroup and return to collect Parma's army, so they lost an army. I hope you know how. Their journey back to Spain was also a disaster. So, factors contributing to the defeat of the Armada: English strength, Spanish weakness, and luck. Luck was the death of Spain's leading admiral, and the weather making it impossible for the Spanish fleet to return to the Channel after the Battle of Gravelines, forcing it to travel into the dangerous waters of Scotland and Ireland. English strengths: the English improved their shipbuilding. They had several technological advantages. They had smaller, lighter, more easy to handle ships that were faster, with cannons that could be reloaded much quicker than the Spanish ones. They also had more effective tactics, and they managed to stay out of range of the Spanish ships who had aimed to go alongside and jump on board and have hand-to-hand combat. And the Spanish weaknesses: most of the men lacked experience, and their plan to meet the Duke of Parma at Dunkirk was seriously flawed. They didn't control a deep water port where the Armada could anchor safely, so the ships were extremely vulnerable to an attack while it waited for Parma's troop to escape the Dutch blockade. Oh my god. England's victory removed the threat of Spanish invasion. Yes, that makes sense. Next, we have a section on education. During Elizabeth's reign, people increasingly began to recognise the importance of education. Many new schools were set up, and more people than ever learned how to read and write. Children received a basic education at home. Petty schools taught reading, writing and maths. There were small local schools that provided a basic education. There was a big increase in the number of grammar schools. Grammar schools had existed for centuries, but there was now a big expansion, with the foundation of around 100 new grammar schools. And the number of university students was increasing. When people left grammar school, some boys went on to study at one of 2 English universities, Oxford or Cambridge. Then we have sports, pastime and the theatre. Elizabethan England was the golden age of the arts and theatre, I do believe. Some Elizabethan pastimes include tennis, fencing, football and theatre. Hunting and sports were an important part of court life. Ordinary people had little time though for leisure activities, because most people worked 6 days a week and went to church on Sundays. But the theatre did become very popular later in Elizabeth's reign, and Elizabeth herself enjoyed plays and often had them performed at court. She supported her favourite performers and even set up an acting company called the Queen's Men. Then we have, I'm just going to move you down and closer. Okay, there you go, now I can sit like this. You were a little bit far then, weren't you? Then we have, a section called poverty. The growing number of people living in poverty was a major problem in Elizabethan England. Population growth led to rising prices. Developments in agriculture left many people unemployed, and religious change meant that there was less support for the poor. Then we have another page on poverty. Elizabeth's government introduced a series of poor laws to try and tackle the problems of poverty. The government became more involved in poor relief. Traditionally, the main source of support for the poor was charity, rich people making donations. But people began to realise that society as a whole would have to take responsibility for helping the poor, and so the government began to take action to tackle the problem. People believed the poor could be split into 3 categories: the helpless poor, those who were unable to support themselves, like orphans, the elderly, sick or disabled; the deserving poor, people who wanted to work but weren't able to find a job in their hometown or village; and the undeserving poor, beggars, criminals and people who refused to work. Also migrant workers or vagabonds who left their homes and travelled around looking for work. The poor laws gave help to the helpless and deserving poor. The 1563 Poor Law gave magistrates the power to raise local funds. Another Poor Law in 1572 gave local officials the power to decide how much people should pay, and the undeserving poor were treated harshly. Under the 1563 Poor Law, the undeserving poor could be publicly whipped. In 1572, the punishment was made even harsher. They faced whipping and having a hole bored through their right ear. Repeat offenders would be imprisoned or might even face execution. Then we have exploration and discovery. Elizabeth's reign was an exciting time to be a sailor. Developments in navigation and shipbuilding were finally opening up the oceans and enabling explorers to discover the world beyond Europe. The English were slow to take an interest in exploration, but new technology made longer journeys possible, and rivalry with Spain encouraged exploration. So I hope you know things like The Art of Navigation by Martin Cortez. English navigator John Davis invented the backstaff, which was easier to use and more accurate than the sea astrolabe. And there were improvements in map making. In the 1550s, English international trade was dominated by exports of woolen cloth to Europe. Merchants wanted international trade to be more varied and looked for new routes into Europe. And then there is another page on exploration and discovery. Explorers were attracted by economic opportunities, and Francis Drake sailed around the world in 1580. Between 1577 and 1580, Francis Drake sailed all the way around the world. This was only the second global circumnavigation and the first by an English sailor. But he wasn't just trying to sail around the world. It seems that he was sent by Queen Elizabeth to explore the coast of South America, looking for opportunities for English colonisation and trade. He almost certainly planned to make money on the expedition by raiding Spanish colonies and treasure ships. On his return to England, Drake was knighted by Queen Elizabeth aboard his ship, the Golden Hind. This royal recognition and vast wealth that Drake brought back from the journey encouraged more sailors to set out on longer distance journeys. Then we have Raleigh and Virginia. In the 1580s, England tried to challenge Spain's dominance as an imperial power by establishing a colony in North America, but creating a permanent settlement turned out to be pretty tricky. Walter Raleigh received permission to explore and colonise. In the early 1580s, England had claimed some territory in North America but hadn't managed to establish a successful colony yet. In 1583, Sir Humphrey Gilbert set out to establish a colony in Newfoundland, but it failed. After that, Elizabeth gave Walter Raleigh permission to explore and colonise unclaimed territories. She wanted him to establish a colony on the Atlantic coast of North America. Raleigh's attempts to colonise Virginia were actually unsuccessful. In 1584, he sent a fact-finding mission to North America, and there were several factors that contributed to the failure of the Roanoke colony. The supply of ships were delayed by the Armada, and the colony couldn't survive. They didn't have supplies, planters didn't take enough with them, and found it difficult to grow food, and it was poorly organised because Raleigh's funds were too limited. And that is the end of it. You have a revision summary. Let's do that. Queen, Government and Religion, 1558 to 1569. Who were Queen Elizabeth I's parents? What was the role of the Privy Council? Describe Queen Elizabeth's character. Give 3 reasons why the threat of invasion by the French had lessened by 1562. Write down 4 key beliefs of Protestant reformers. Name the 2 acts of the Elizabethan religious settlement. Why did the Puritans oppose the religious settlement? Explain what the word recusant means. Why did Mary, Queen of Scots, have a strong claim to the English throne? What were the casket letters? Challenges at home and abroad, 1569 to 1588. Give 3 reasons for the 1569 revolt of the Northern Earls. Name 3 Catholic plots against Queen Elizabeth. Who was Francis Walsingham? Why was Queen Elizabeth reluctant to execute Mary, Queen of Scots? Why were there growing tensions between England and Spain in the 1570s and 80s? Give 4 reasons why Dudley's campaign in the Netherlands failed. Why did Francis Drake sail to Spain in 1587? Explain what the phrase the singeing of the King of Spain's beard means. Who led the Spanish Armada? How did the English attack the Armada at Calais? Write down 4 reasons why the English Navy defeated the Spanish Armada. And finally, Elizabethan society in the Age of Exploration, 1558 to 1588. What was a petty school? Give 3 subjects students studied at university. Name 3 pastimes that were popular at Elizabeth's court. Name 2 theatres that were built in London during Elizabeth's reign. Why was the problem of poverty growing in Elizabethan England? What were the 3 categories of poor people in Elizabethan England? Give 2 measures that were introduced by the 1563 Poor Law. How did new technology encourage global exploration? Explain why Francis Drake sailed across the Pacific. Who organised the attempted colonisation of Virginia in the 1580s? And why is Roanoke Island known as the Lost Colony? I hope that helps a little bit, even though we didn't go through all of it and I skimmed a lot of sections. Even just playing this while you're trying to go to sleep or putting on your makeup or eating your dinner might help something go in, or it might jog your memory, and I really hope it does. Good luck with your exams. I'll see you again soon. Bye bye.